The journal was bound in cracked, blackened leather, and it smelled faintly of iron and roses. Nate Carter had no idea why his billionaire uncle had left it for him, or why the words inside seemed to rearrange themselves when he wasn't looking. "Success is a formula," Victor Carter's scrawled handwriting began. "But formulas demand precision, and precision requires sacrifice." Nate shut the journal and tossed it onto the desk, feeling its weight in the room, like an unblinking pair of eyes fixed on his every move. If he had known inheriting a fortune came with this kind of baggage, he might have walked away. Then again, he'd never been good at walking away from a mystery. Nathaniel Nate Carter had grown up in the shadow of wealth, but never quite in its glow. His father, Victor's younger brother, had spent his life chasing fleeting business ventures, dragging the family across the country in pursuit of a fortune that never materialized. Nate had learned early on to keep his expectations low and his independence high. By the time he reached his late 20s, Nate had perfected the art of survival on the fringes. He was an artist, or at least that's what he told himself and anyone who asked. His one-bedroom apartment in a rundown part of Portland served as both a studio and a sanctuary. The walls were covered with half-finished paintings of surreal cityscapes, shadowy figures, and scenes that always seemed to hint at something just out of reach. His days were spent sketching or scouring thrift stores for inspiration. His nights, however, were filled with something darker, an inexplicable yearning for more. Not just more money, though that would have been nice, but more purpose. Nate was a man in search of answers he didn't know how to phrase. Before we dive deeper into Nate's story, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a tale that keeps you questioning reality itself. Now let's uncover the secrets behind Victor Carter's fortune. The call came on a gray November morning. Nate had been nursing a cup of instant coffee and staring at an empty canvas, trying to summon the will to start. The lawyer on the other end of the line spoke with the clipped efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering bad news. "Mr. Nathaniel Carter, I'm calling to inform you that your uncle, Victor Carter, has passed away." Nate hadn't spoken to Victor in years, not since a tense Christmas dinner when he was 16, where Victor had mocked his father for being the family failure. Still, the news sent a strange pang through him. Victor was larger than life, a figure of wealth and power who seemed untouchable. "What does this have to do with me?" Nate asked, expecting the conversation to end with some perfunctory condolences. The lawyer's tone shifted slightly, betraying a hint of intrigue. "Mr. Carter left instructions in his will. You are named as the sole beneficiary of his mansion and its contents." Nate blinked, certain he'd misheard. "The mansion?" "Yes," the lawyer confirmed. "He left a letter explaining his decision. It appears he felt a unique connection with you." Nate couldn't help but laugh, though there was no humor in it. Victor had barely acknowledged his existence when he was alive. Why now? The mansion sat on a sprawling estate outside of the city, shrouded in mist and surrounded by towering pines. The house itself was an architectural enigma, part Gothic castle, part modern fortress. Its sharp spires and dark stone facade gave the impression of a place designed to keep the world out. When Nate arrived, the lawyer handed him a thick envelope with Victor's signature across the seal. "I'll leave you to settle in," the lawyer said, his tone almost apologetic, as if he knew something Nate didn't. Inside the envelope was a letter and a key. The letter was brief, written in Victor's unmistakable handwriting. "Nate, you are more like me than you realize. This house and what it contains now belong to you. Be cautious, be diligent, and above all, follow the rules." It wasn't exactly the warm, posthumous embrace Nate might have hoped for, but it was enough to pique his curiosity. The house was eerily silent as Nate explored, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors. The air smelled faintly of old wood and something metallic, and the walls were lined with ornate mirrors that seemed to tilt ever so slightly when he passed. The library was the most impressive room by far, with towering shelves filled with leather-bound books that looked as though they hadn't been touched in decades. It was here, in a locked drawer of the massive oak desk, that Nate found the journal. It was heavier than it looked, its cover worn and stained. The pages were filled with Victor's handwriting, some of it neat and meticulous, some of it frantic and barely legible. The first page bore a simple title, Principles of Prosperity and Power. The initial entries were innocuous enough, lessons on discipline, ambition, and hard work. But as Nate flipped further, the tone darkened. Phrases like "the balance must be maintained" and "every gain requires a loss" were underlined in bold strokes. And then there were the rules. The third bell must never chime. Always keep a fresh rose in the west garden. Do not ignore the shadow. Nate felt a chill creep down his spine. These weren't the musings of a savvy businessman. They were the ramblings of a man obsessed. That night, as Nate lay in the guest bedroom staring at the cracked plaster ceiling, he heard it. A faint, rhythmic ticking coming from the hallway. He got up to investigate, his bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. The ticking led him to an old grandfather clock at the end of the corridor. It stood silent and still, its face covered in a layer of dust. Yet, as Nate reached out to touch it, the pendulum swung once, twice, 3 times. The clock chimed, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the house. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Nate backed away, his heart pounding. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The next morning, Nate returned to the journal, compelled to understand what Victor had left behind. The words seemed different somehow, as if they had rearranged themselves overnight. The final line of the day's entry read, "The inheritance is not wealth. It is responsibility." Nate closed the journal and stared out the window at the overgrown garden below. He had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning, and that walking away might no longer be an option. Nate's journey had only just begun, but the deeper he delved into his uncle's secrets, the more he realized that Victor's success was anything but ordinary. The rules weren't just suggestions, they were survival. The rules were impossible to ignore. Nate had spent hours staring at the journal, trying to convince himself it was nothing more than the ramblings of a paranoid man, but something about the words felt alive. They lingered in his mind, crawling under his skin like tiny insects, demanding attention. By the second morning, the rules had transformed from unsettling curiosities into something much worse. A puzzle he was too afraid to solve and too intrigued to abandon. The West Garden was Nate's first stop after breakfast, a meager meal of stale granola he found in the mansion's cavernous kitchen. As he stepped outside, he expected to find a neglected, overgrown patch of land, but what he saw stopped him in his tracks. The garden was lush, vibrant, and impossibly alive. Roses of every color sprawled across the grounds, their petals glistening with dew despite the cold, gray sky. The scent was overwhelming, a cloying mix of sweetness and decay that made his stomach churn. Victor's journal had mentioned the garden specifically. A fresh rose must always be placed in the foyer by midnight. No exceptions. Nate hesitated. He didn't believe in rituals or superstitions, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the roses didn't belong here. They thrived despite the biting November air, their colors unnaturally vivid. And then there was the hum, barely audible, like a swarm of bees just out of sight. He plucked a single red rose, the stem prickling his fingers with unnaturally sharp thorns. The moment he did, the hum stopped. Back inside, the mansion seemed colder than before, as though it disapproved of his intrusion into the garden. Nate placed the rose in a small crystal vase on the foyer table, exactly as the journal instructed. For a moment, the oppressive weight he'd felt since arriving seemed to lift. But it didn't last. As the day wore on, Nate began to notice strange things. Small at first, but impossible to dismiss. The mirrors in the hallway seemed to reflect parts of the room that weren't there. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, even when there was no source of light. And then there were the noises. It started with faint tapping, like fingers drumming on a distant window. By mid-afternoon, it had escalated to whispers, low, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Nate tried to ignore them, chalking it up to his imagination or the house settling, but deep down, he knew better. That evening, Nate sat in the library, the journal open in front of him. He flipped through the pages, searching for something, anything, that might explain what was happening. One entry caught his attention. Rituals are the key to control. Follow them, and the house will remain silent. Ignore them, and it will remind you of its power. Nate's skepticism wavered. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but the journal wasn't asking for belief. It was asking for compliance. He decided to test it. The clock in the hallway had been silent all day, its pendulum still. But according to the journal, the third chime was significant. Dangerous even. Nate wound the clock, setting it to chime 3 times at midnight. As the hands crept closer to 12, the air in the mansion seemed to grow heavier. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, though Nate still couldn't make out the words. When the clock struck midnight, the chimes echoed through the house. The third chime rang louder than the rest, reverberating in Nate's chest like a hammer blow. And then the house roared to life. Doors slammed shut on their own, the windows rattling violently despite the still night air. The whispers erupted into a cacophony of voices, each one screaming over the other. Nate bolted from the library, his heart pounding. He stumbled into the hallway, where the mirrors now reflected grotesque versions of himself. Faces twisted in agony, eyes black and empty. He fled to the foyer, gasping for air, and froze. The rose he had placed on the table was gone, replaced by a withered, blackened stem. It took hours for the house to settle again. By dawn, Nate was exhausted but determined. He needed answers, and the journal was the only place he could hope to find them. Flipping to the later pages, he found an entry written in Victor's shaky handwriting. The house does not forgive. Each rule is a thread in the fabric of its power. Pull one loose, and it unravels. Follow them, and it will reward you. Defy them, and it will punish you. Victor had known about the house's malevolence, yet he had lived here for decades. Somehow he had managed to keep it under control. The question was how? The next entry offered a chilling insight. Power demands sacrifice. Each rule upheld strengthens the pact. Each rule broken weakens it. The house feeds on balance, our compliance in exchange for its silence. The realization hit Nate like a punch to the gut. Victor's fortune wasn't built on hard work or clever investments. It was built on whatever this house represented. A dark, hungry force, bound by the rules Victor had written. But why had Victor chosen him as the heir? Nate wasn't powerful or ambitious. He was just an artist, a nobody scraping by on his own terms. The journal didn't provide an answer, but it did offer a choice: obey the rules and inherit Victor's wealth, or defy them and risk losing everything, including his sanity. Nate wasn't ready to give up, but he wasn't ready to surrender either. He needed to understand the house, its rules, and its power. Only then could he decide what to do next. That night, as the clock struck 3, Nate stood in the library with the journal in one hand and the ceremonial dagger he had found in Victor's desk in the other. If the house wanted to test him, he was ready. But deep down, he knew that whatever he uncovered next would change him forever. The house was alive, its rules more than just arbitrary instructions. They were binding agreements. Nate understood that now. But as he sat in the library, staring at Victor's journal, he couldn't shake the feeling that the rules weren't meant to protect him. They were meant to trap him. The mansion wasn't just a home or a fortress, it was a predator, and Nate was its latest prey. Nate didn't sleep that night. The oppressive weight of the house seemed heavier than ever, its walls pressing in, its whispers relentless. He needed answers, and the journal wasn't enough. If Victor had lived here for decades, he must have left more behind. More clues, more insights, more of the truth. The attic seemed the logical place to start. Armed with a flashlight and a reluctant sense of determination, Nate climbed the narrow staircase, his footsteps creaking on the worn wooden steps. The attic was a cavernous space, its beams arching like the ribs of some massive beast. Dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight as he scanned the room. Boxes were piled haphazardly, some labeled in Victor's meticulous handwriting, others covered in years of grime. Nate started with a box marked Records 1980 to 1990. Inside, he found ledgers, stock certificates, and business contracts, evidence of Victor's vast wealth. But beneath the documents was something more peculiar, a stack of Polaroid photos, each one capturing a different part of the mansion. At first glance, the photos seemed ordinary, shots of the foyer, the library, the garden. But as Nate flipped through them, he noticed something strange. In every photo, a shadow lingered, darker and denser than it should have been. It wasn't the shadow of furniture or a trick of the light, it was a presence. In the last photo, taken in the West Garden, the shadow wasn't just lingering, it was looming. A tall, human-like figure stood among the roses, featureless but undeniably there. Nate's stomach turned. He flipped the photo over, finding a single word scrawled in Victor's handwriting. Observe. Back in the hallway, Nate avoided the mirrors. He'd seen enough in their warped reflections to know they weren't just decorative. But as he passed one on his way to the library, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement that wasn't his own. He froze, his pulse quickening. The mirror's surface shimmered, and for a brief moment he saw the library reflected in its depths. But it wasn't the library as it was now. It was a version of the room bathed in crimson light, its shelves empty, its windows cracked. In the center of the room stood a figure, its back to the mirror. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Nate took a step back, and the image vanished. The mirror reflected only the empty hallway. Victor's journal had been clear: follow the rules or face the consequences. Nate wasn't sure how many rules he had broken already, but he knew the house was keeping count. That night, as the grandfather clock struck midnight, Nate sat in the library, the journal open on the desk in front of him. The rose in the foyer was fresh, its petals glistening with dew. The clock had been wound, its chimes carefully limited to 2. For the first time since his arrival, the house was silent. But silence didn't mean safety. Nate's eyes were drawn to the journal's final pages, where Victor's handwriting grew frantic, the ink smudged as though written in haste. "The pact is not permanent," one entry read. "The house must be appeased regularly, or it will seek another way to sustain itself." Another entry, written in bolder strokes, added, "Beware the shadow. It is the keeper of the pact, and it does not forgive." Nate flipped the page and found a single line scrawled in red ink. "Do not let it follow you." Determined to understand the pact, Nate decided to conduct a test. The house had rules, yes, but it also had weaknesses. It thrived on fear and compliance. But what if Nate refused to play its game? He chose the rule about the West Garden, the one that demanded a fresh rose in the foyer by midnight. This time, he left the vase empty. Midnight came and went, the grandfather clock chiming twice, its sound echoing through the mansion. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the whispers began. They were louder this time, more insistent, filling the air with a cacophony of voices speaking in languages Nate couldn't understand. The temperature dropped, and the lights flickered, casting the room into intermittent darkness. And then he saw it. The shadow from the Polaroid emerged from the corner of the library, its form shifting and undulating like smoke. It moved with unnatural speed, closing the distance between them in seconds. Nate stumbled back, his heart racing. The shadow stopped just short of him, its presence cold and suffocating. It didn't speak, but Nate felt its intent, a silent accusation, a demand for compliance. Gathering his courage, Nate stood his ground. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice trembling. The shadow tilted its head as if considering his question. Then, without warning, it dissolved, leaving the room eerily quiet. In the aftermath of the encounter, Nate searched the library for answers. He tore through the shelves, pulling down books and scattering papers in his desperation. Finally, he found it, a hidden compartment in the desk containing a second journal. This one was older, its pages brittle with age. The handwriting inside wasn't Victor's, but belonged to someone else, a previous owner of the mansion, perhaps. The entries were cryptic, filled with references to the pact and the keeper. One passage stood out. "The house demands balance. Wealth for obedience, power for sacrifice. The keeper enforces the terms, but it is bound by the same rules it protects." Another entry added, "To break the pact is to face the keeper's wrath, but to understand the pact is to control it." Nate's mind raced. The house wasn't invincible. It had rules, and those rules could be exploited. If Victor had managed to control the house for decades, then so could he. Armed with this newfound knowledge, Nate decided to push further. The house thrived on fear, but it also depended on his compliance. If he could disrupt the balance without breaking the pact entirely, he might be able to weaken its hold. He started with small acts of defiance, leaving doors open, moving objects out of place, ignoring the whispers that followed him everywhere. Each time, the house reacted, its anger palpable but restrained. The shadow appeared more frequently now, watching him from corners and mirrors, but it never approached. Nate took it as a sign that he was on the right track. But the real test came 1 week later, when the journal demanded a ritual sacrifice. a token of life, offered willingly. Victor's note suggested he had used animals for this purpose, but Nate refused. Instead, he placed the withered rose from the first night in the center of the library, its petals blackened and brittle. The house responded immediately. The lights flickered, the whispers grew deafening, and the shadow emerged once more, its form larger and more menacing than before. But this time, Nate wasn't afraid. "I'm not playing your game," he said, his voice steady. "You need me as much as I need you. So here's my offer. Leave me alone, and I'll keep the pact. Push me, and I'll find a way to destroy you." The shadow froze, its form rippling as if uncertain. For a moment, Nate thought it might attack, but then it receded, disappearing into the darkness. By dawn, the house was silent. The oppressive weight had lifted, replaced by a strange sense of equilibrium. Nate knew the battle wasn't over, but he had won this round. For the first time since inheriting the mansion, he felt a glimmer of hope. The house was a predator, yes, but it was also bound by its own rules. And if Nate could learn to navigate those rules, he might just survive. But deep down, he knew the truth. The mansion had chosen him for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it wasn't finished with him yet. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this chilling story, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe for more twisted tales and spine-tingling mysteries. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Got thoughts or theories about the story? Drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. And as always, stay curious but careful. See you in the next one.